you can see, we are started already, and we have Jared already with us, and I'll be as quick as I can. He's going to talk to us about introduction to PySpark in Microsoft Fabric, and the moment I'm done with the intro, I'm behind time, but it's all good. And if you have questions, put in the Q&A. I know he's a veteran, so I will let him decide if he wants to answer them at the end, or he asks me if there are questions, and probably sees them in the chat and he decides to answer. But you definitely put them in the chat so that you don't lose the questions you have. I'm going to paste this in the chat. It's the larger community platform so that you get involved beyond just these webinars that happen twice a month. And Jared, as you can see, he's not just a tech person, so he's someone who is been consulting for over a decade and purely, into Microsoft products and data engineering. But much longer, he's been in the theater and performing arts, and he's a speaker. He likes to combine these two aspects of him, and he runs a YouTube channel called Data Band, and he's presented at different popular events, and we are fortunate to have him here. So I'm going to hand over to him. Over to you, Jared. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I will be in the chat. Yes, sir. Over to you.
Certainly. I'll go and share screen. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, pleasure to be here and very thankful to be participating in the community. I'll say I've been really getting back into this for about the past, 3 years now. And by far, this is one of the things I look forward to the most is getting involved in community, sharing a knowledge, and really just helping contribute back to a community that over many years has taught me quite a few things over the years. So very happy to be here. Michael already gave me a little bit of an introduction, but to build on that, a couple of additional things to note. Uh, as far as the topic today, I am a Microsoft MVP for Fabric, which I look at that really as both lenses. One is being an advocate for Microsoft products and effective use of them, but the second part is also holding Microsoft to a standard and making sure that the products that they're making and the efforts that they're putting out there are to build the best solutions for us data professionals to do what we want. That's the main reason I wanted that indication there. So all the more if you need somebody to help advocate for changes in Microsoft products, especially in the Fabric space, by all means reach out to me. I am happy to help advocate for things like that. Other part, as Michael mentioned, is I run the YouTube channel Data Bard. But really, I try to think of myself generally as a data bard for two main reasons, and that's because a data bard has two facets. One is the technical nerd side, which is I've been consulting for well over a decade. I'm currently solutions architect for SHI, helping organizations figure out what they want to do with Fabric. But the other part is why you're here at an online in-person event. Is that a thing? But you're here at an event with other people in the community. There's something about human beings that we don't just rightly like reading technical documentation day in and day out. We best learn from one another and we best share information with one another through storytelling, and that's something that I take very seriously. So my goal this evening is to tell you a story, hopefully it gives you some useful information on today's topic, helps you take that next step on your data journey. We'll gloss over the agenda here for sake of time, but the main thing I want to call out here is especially that fourth part, as Michael mentioned, Q&A. I'm happy to stop at any point that people have questions pertaining to topics or specific pieces of information, especially because, as the title suggests, this is intro level. You shouldn't have to know much of anything to get value out of this, and I take that very seriously. I don't like people getting lost in my intro presentations. So please, as you have those questions, raise them as you feel comfortable. I will be happy to answer any and every questions you have with the time that we have available. With that, we'll jump right into presentation. And as a presenter working in the data industry, I always start my presentations with questions because we work in the data industry. We're all about answering questions. That's why we exist. So here's your question to consider for tonight's presentation. Why PySpark? When you think about the industry today, and this is a lot of the criticism Sven gives me. Sven's my counterpart that works with me. Very smart guy, really good data engineer, but he is very, very particular when it comes to use of technology. And as soon as I had the idea of bringing this into the fold, he challenged me very strongly and said, Data Bard, why the heck would we need something like PySpark when we have already such a wonderful capability in Python? Python's been a clear topic lately here, and it's got a bunch of wonderful things going on for it. It's a good third generation programming languages, object oriented programming, interacting with things. It's wonderful there, but Python's especially great because of its community support. It's not necessarily tied to specific vendors. It's been supported by the community itself, and that makes it special. And when you think about that in the libraries, all the libraries that everybody's created in the community, Python's pretty good. And Sven does have a very good point. When we think about the tech that we have today in the data industry, from working with SQL and our relational data, to Python, to SQL, to R, to SQL, we have a lot of tech in our world today that already enables us to work with data, and Python seems to have a pretty good share in working with things in more of that third generation world. So why add something new to the options with PySpark? Well, there's one particular limitation that Python has, and it really comes down to this point: scalability. When we talk about scaling out in the tech world, there's really two options. You either scale up, you create one really large box with a bunch of compute, can do a bunch of operations, or you scale out. You create a bunch of smaller boxes that can perform different operations, hence why most companies today don't run your entire enterprise on a single server. You break them out into separate servers for different purposes, and especially for the distributed compute. Python has an issue with the scaling out option, at least native Python, in that it has a particular thing called the Global Interpreter Lock, or GIL. Important phrase. I encourage you to research that if you're interested in learning more about this. But the long and the short of it is Python environments typically are focused on single node computing, scaling up. They have controls on the thread of Python as it executes in the environment. And by controlling that thread and the memory contained around it, it really restricts multi-threading, and therefore scaling out really is not an option. Leaves us in a weird state where Python has a lot of good utility, but in terms of scale, you get to a certain threshold, and more often than not, Python starts to struggle in terms of performance. So Sven, why should we care about Python? Because, or why should we care about PySpark? Because we're going to solve that problem. So go away, Sven. We don't need your negativity here. We need to jump into why PySpark itself is important. And that's because it solves this problem by giving us a Python API on an Apache Spark environment. Very short definition, that's all there is to PySpark. Python Spark, it's Python, but run within the context of Apache Spark. What Apache Spark then gives us is a very well-rounded architecture that supports scaling out in the form of distributed computing through a mechanism we call resilient distributed datasets, or RDD, the other counterpart to the global interpreter lock. What this means is that we have a specific architecture that understands how to take an object, or as we think about it, our data sets, and knows that if I have 10 cluster or 10 nodes within a Spark cluster, I can take my data and split it across those 10 nodes, give give each section a copy of instructions of what to perform on each of those subsets of data. Each compute node does that work independently, collects the results back in a central location, and you just work with the end results. This is why PySpark is so important. It solves the problem of distributed computing and lets us go and work with Python capabilities, but on a much larger data set. That's the power of PySpark. So to really encompass that in today's presentation, let's break down each of these sections and talk about the different capabilities here, which means we're talking Python, we're talking Spark, and then obviously we're talking about things within the context of Fabric, which Fabric should be answering this question. What does Fabric provide that makes it easier to do what we want to do with this technology? Keep that in the back of your mind as we go through today's presentation. With that, let's go to our next slide. And just a quick show of hands, if people want to use the raising hand capabilities in Teams, is there anybody here who's interested in this topic and is not familiar with Python? You're very new to Python, you maybe have read a little bit, but you haven't written a lot of code. Is Python new to anybody? Waiting a moment for the raising of hands, taking a quick drink because I need it. Okay, so maybe at least Python is familiar to everybody, and if so, we'll go through this section really quickly. But ultimately, this is about for those who have not worked with Python before and want to make sure that they understand the demonstration that we'll be doing later on in today's presentation. Here's your quick cheat sheet, or if nothing else, share this with your friends if they're new to Python. Important things to know about Python in 5 minutes. First of all, hit the hashtag to comment. No, I'm not asking you to go out on social media and talk about today's presentation. Although that honestly would be cool. Social media algorithms love data. So if you feel so inclined, by all means, go out there and engage on social media and talk about how awesome this presentation is. Please, I need help with the marketing. Um, but the hashtag is really important to Python because that turns our lovely text here green. As we know with most IDEs, that means this is text that isn't executable, and because of that, we get ways to document our code, which I always say, even in today's world with AI can tell you how code works. It will never tell you why somebody wrote things the way that they did. So comments are really important. I'll say also the multi-line comments, there is the 3-quote option that exists, but you'll see for me, typically I will do the single quotes or the single hashtags for even multi-line comments. Why? The 3 single quotes turns my text red. I don't want red comments, I want green comments. And so for that, I stick with the hashtags, but obviously use whatever your preference is there. Import, keyword, important for importing libraries. As I mentioned earlier, the power of Python has been the way the community has supported the language in the form of building libraries to support many functions. So make sure before you take any time to code things in Python, do some research. See if somebody out in the community has built a library that's going to support what you're looking to do. If so, you'll save yourself some coding time by utilizing the libraries available. DEF, another important keyword, means a function here. So for example, we have DEF, greet is the name of our function. Good parentheses in there says that we have a name variable and allows us to print a very basic hello world, or in this case, hello name, whatever the name ends up being. But the key thing to call out here as far as functions go is this. Indentations are necessary. Sorry if you like all of your code sitting on the left side of the screen and you never indent anything with spaces or tabs. Unfortunately, Python, that doesn't work. Why? Indentation defines scope. So at any point, when text like this is indented, that suggests that is within scope of this function. Once we hit the point where the text is no longer indented, now we've hit the end of the scope of this function. Very important because that covers things like function definitions, looping situations, conditional statements, if else, or try catch. All of them expect that whatever is indented after that, that defines your scope. We then have to take a moment, fold our hands, and say, praise be the data frame, the workhorse of anybody who wants to work with Python or PySpark and do things with data. Why? Because the data frame is your workhorse to do things with structured data. Think of a data frame as a very simple single sheet Excel document, rows, columns, all containing the lovely data that we want to consume. The data frame is especially important Because more often than not, your process working with PySpark is going to be load data into a data frame, transform the data, save off the results into storage. But the data frame is what makes that all happen. Variables can be anything, especially for the SQL professionals in the room. This is something that you might find frustrating with Python. Variable definitions are very flexible. You just define the name of the variable, equal signs, and you pass something into the variable. In data types, you'll see I don't have that defined anywhere on this example. Python doesn't really define that because it doesn't compile. It is something that Python is really evaluated at runtime and not before. To wit, it then does not care about data types. Data type enforcement is purely your responsibility. You can see here I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different variables here, and they can store things like objects. They can store text. They can be dynamic. They can store integers. I could do all of this with one single variable and pass in this object, and then this string into the same variable, and then this string into the one before. I could pass an integer into it. Python will not care. That will run successfully. So the key word I have for people working with this, make sure you really test your code well, because you don't want to find a data type error only at runtime, which is the first time you'll find that. Formatting strings, very popular here, and there's just one particular notation I want to call out, which is this one. This F looks like a typo in front of what is clearly a string that looks like it takes in something like a variable. Well, sorry, the F is not a typo. The F is a keyword. That's right. In the Python language, the letter F is a key word. Why? I don't know. Talk to the people who made Python. But in any case, that is an important notation here. Is it essentially the F here saying in this situation of this string, anytime we see curly brackets like this and a variable in between, we're replacing that space with whatever is in this name variable. In this case, it would say hello Alice. I also bring this up though because be very, very, very careful using this notation, because this part here especially is very easy to have code injection occur. It's a security liability. So it's great for simple circumstances. Don't use it for your high secure data that is needed in production. Don't do that. You're going to cause yourself some issues. Finally, at least calling out style guidelines are always important for languages. So if you're looking to get started with this and don't know how to style your code effectively for readability and for administration of code, I encourage following the PEP 8 guidelines. They're pretty straightforward and seem to be well adopted in the community because it was built by the community. All right, that's at least the Python in a nutshell. Now let's talk about the next part, Spark. And this is where we're going to start shifting into Fabric, because really there's two things to talk about. One, the distributed computing, which I already explained earlier with Spark, but also part of the issue we've had with distributed computing in the past is setting up these environments, Hadoop and such, has been really complicated for a very long time. And I mentioned earlier, Fabric is supposed to try and make things easier. This is a great place where Fabric is making it easier to work with a strong, powerful tool in Apache Spark. But this is also under the assumption that for those viewing this, you may not be the administrator for your Fabric environment and therefore may not have administrator controls over the environment. If that's the case, there's two main topics you need to talk about with your Fabric admin to make sure it sets up you, an end user, for a wonderful experience working with this technology. The first thing you need to talk about is Spark pools. And no, we're not going to go in swimming in a pool and then throw a toaster into it. No, we're talking Spark pools, and this is where we're talking about the definition of the hardware. What does our Spark cluster look like? You as an end user won't have control over this, but your admin will. And since this determines how your solution will scale out, you want to talk to your admin and make sure that the appropriately sized cluster is available for you. As far as the amount of capacity that you have is dependent on the fabric capacity that you have defined in the workspace. And you basically take the number associated to that capacity, you multiply it by 2, that determines the total number of vcores that you have available to put within the cluster. And then from there, you're splitting up those vcores between node sizes, which each node size takes up so many vcores, and then you define the number of nodes that exist within the cluster. This ultimately gives you control of your environment. You want to make sure you talk to your Fabric admin about this, because if not, you get this message at the bottom when you're trying to run your code. The Spark job can't run because you've hit a Spark compute or API rate limit. That means you've hit the restrictions on your capacity itself, and you need to talk to your admin to figure out where the restriction is and what needs to be done to resolve that. Second thing you need to talk about is an environment. Where Spark pulls is about hardware, environments is about configuration. And that includes things like defining the Spark pool that your process will work on, but it also includes important things like runtimes. If you need to work with specific versions of Spark or Delta, that's controlled by your environment. I also mentioned libraries earlier. Your default Fabric environments will have a fair amount of libraries available to support whatever coding you're trying to do, but it won't have every library that's ever been created. And it also won't magically contain libraries like if you create some yourself. So in situations like that, you have two options. Either one, you always have to install the libraries that you want into your environment when your process starts running. A lot of work for an end user. Or you work with your Fabric admin to define an environment that knows these are the additional libraries that need to be loaded into the environment. And as soon as you get started with your cluster up and running, the library is automatically there and available for you, ready to use. Make sure you have these two conversations with your admins, or bad things will happen. We don't want to have that experience for anyone. All right. And then that tells me we need to get into demos. So let me pause for a moment. I think the last I saw, I don't know if I've seen any questions come in on Q&A. Doesn't look like it yet. If so, we will jump right into demo, which is where we will be for the remainder of today. There we go. Let's close that out, bring up my environment here. So we are here in Fabric, and we are here in a Fabric notebook. Now, I guess similarly, a quick show of hands, is there anybody here who's not familiar with working with Jupyter notebooks? If not, I can at least give a quick overview of that, because the notebook experience is going to be your primary way of working with PySpark within Fabric. Okay, looks like at least a couple of hands on that front. So let me at least talk about Jupyter Notebooks quick in a nutshell. Most environments that you've worked in, be it SQL, be it working with Python scripts or C, or a lot of coding languages, work in situations where a file defines your process. But especially when you're talking debugging, it's not always great to have to run an entire file in order to figure out if part of it succeeds or fails. To solve that problem, for well over a decade now, we've had the capabilities of Jupyter Notebooks. The long and the short of Jupyter Notebooks is it breaks down your code from one file down to cells that you can define yourself. The benefit of cells is, one, you can run cells independently, so you at least have the flexibility of running individual lines of code, and solves the debugging process a lot, which is really nice, especially when you're dealing with large data sets. The second benefit is when you break down your code in Jupyter Notebooks, you have two cell options. Your first one is the one you would expect to see, code cells, that has actual executable code in it. But you have a second one, Markdown. For anybody who likes writing things in Markdown, it's a little bit hard to notate, But when you get something like this polished section here, you can actually get some pretty nice, well-established, well-formatted documentation within your notebooks so the documentation lives with your code. So I'm a strong advocate for Markdown, for documenting why you should be doing things. As far as Fabric goes, to create this notebook, all I had to do was go into my workspace that is Fabric enabled, hit new item, search for notebook, and click that. And that gets you at least what would be a blank notebook here, but obviously this is a notebook which I prepared earlier, because everybody likes your cooking shows, right? In any case, this markdown cell is giving me the instructions of what I need to make sure I cover with you to make sure you're ready and set to go building things with Fabric notebooks. So the first thing it tells me to talk about is about attaching lakehouses and warehouses. What is that talking about? Well, you know the first step that in dealing with any sort of data process, you need to get access into your data itself. And think about that in a lot of environments. That sometimes can be really frustrating if I need to figure out, okay, what's the credentials I need to pass in order to actually access the data? Do I need to deal with any firewall issues? Is there anything additional that I need to figure out? It gets really messy really quickly. Fabric tries to solve that because Fabric is trying to do everything in one spot. And because it tries to do everything in one spot, it's trying to make those sorts of things easier. This is where we start our journey on the notebooks by looking at this add data items, which especially this has evolved significantly since Fabric came out. I can connect to anything that is in my real-time hub or in my OneLake catalog. All I have to do is look here at my list of available options, check something, hit add, and it would be defined as something, a resource here in my notebook. And this lets me then view things like tables and the structure of that storage. But it actually does much more than that. This is the part where I feel I have to put the disclaimer and say I'm going to do what I consider the legally obligated demo anybody has to do whenever you're demonstrating the Fabric Notebook experience. The additional benefit, besides looking at your storage and seeing that it's right there, if at any point I'm like, I forget the syntax for how exactly to connect to this data store, you don't have to deal with it. I can pick a Delta table sitting here in the tables folder, drag and drop it over. Ooh, and it generated code for me. It generated a nice simple definition of a data frame variable that uses the Spark library innately in the Spark environment and uses a SQL call, which lets me write SQL to query data from a Lakehouse Delta table and then ultimately display it. This showcased one of those things that is very rare to see nowadays, a solution where it generated code and it didn't use AI to do it. I know it's crazy. Like, man, everybody thinks we could just only do it with Gen AI, but fun fact, we've been generating code for decades. And Fabric utilizes that capability here. Obviously, a little bit of a joke there. But at least there, what previously could have been a couple minutes to hours sitting there trying to get connected to a data source takes less than 5 minutes in Fabric. Next thing we need to talk about, setting the default language for the notebook. What am I talking about there? Well, notebooks in Fabric are expected to be flexible. They can work in a lot of different constraints there. What constraints they can work under is all defined under this option here in the top section of the UI. Let me zoom into that to give you a better view here. So when we talk notebooks, notebook does not automatically mean Spark. There are actually three types of notebooks that you can work with in Fabric. There's Spark, where this suggests not only the language you're going to use, such as Python, Scala, SQL, or R, but this is actually determining what is the engine that will be used in Fabric to run this notebook. So I can choose between Spark, I can choose between Python, which would set up a Python environment, or I can do T-SQL Analytics. This essentially uses the same engine that Fabric Warehouses uses, and allows you to write T-SQL against primarily warehouses, but you can also use them against SQL Analytics endpoints. For sake of our topic, we're focusing on this top section here, and that's why we keep our default language here to PySpark. But to be clear, that is merely the default language for the notebook. The fun thing of working in Spark is you can actually switch languages. The language for each cell is defined here in the bottom right of the cell. And as you can see, when I hover over it, looks like I can click on it. And this gives me the option to actually choose what is the language used for this cell. So for example, I can take this cell, I can make it Spark SQL, and if I do my same demonstration as before, it's not giving me PySpark anymore. It's now giving me Spark SQL. So that's at least the nice benefit here is, and this is functional. I'm not just at least doing this for weird demo purposes. You could have a cell that works with PySpark. You can have the next cell work with Spark SQL. The following cell work with PySpark again. It is functional. You'll be able to do that. So if there are certain things, certain types of transformations that you feel more comfortable doing with SQL syntax, you can switch over to that SQL syntax and then come back to PySpark, depending on your use case. As long as we're here, let's also talk about this UI here. Anytime I'm hovering on a cell, I get this lovely bar here with options related to the cell, which includes things like copilots, but everybody's talking about AI nowadays. We don't need to talk about that here. Things like converting this into a markdown. So if I don't want this cell to execute anymore, I can convert it to markdown, or a section that has more commands. We'll look at that later. I'm more curious about this trash can because I added a cell I don't actually want to be here. The trash can lets me delete the cell. Kind of another fun thing about working with Jupyter notebooks. Makes it really easy to manage code if you determine one particular cell is no longer valuable. Hit the button. Yay, you don't need to make sure you select the right lines and make sure you don't create a syntax error as a result. Nobody wants to deal with that. Fabric wants to make it easier for you. Well, in Jupyter notebooks, that's more of a Jupyter capability. All right. So that's at least our default language. Next one is about connecting to session. What is that about? Well, if you come from a database world or from a SQL world, you're typically used to, unless you're working in certain types of cloud environments, we normally expect if I want to query data, the compute is always sitting there waiting for my query. Apache Spark does not work under those same principles. Spark expects the possibility that you might create very large clusters with a whole lot of compute associated to them. Because of that, Spark goes by the opposite precedence, which says you care about not spending a whole lot of money on compute that you're not using. So anytime you're working with Spark, you have to get used to that part of your runtime and your execution isn't just about running your code, it's about spinning up a cluster itself. The fact that we have this connect button up here, the Fabric UI tells us that we do not have a Spark cluster instantiated right now. There's two ways to start up your Spark cluster. One is you could just try and attempt to run a cell within the notebook. And if so, Fabric is smart enough to know, hey, you want to run this cell, well, you need a cluster to do that, so we'll go ahead and spin up a cluster for you based on the definition of the environment here. Or I can hit this button up here and hit connect, which gives me the options of a standard session or high concurrency. The difference between the two is very simple. A standard session is an entire cluster for one notebook. That notebook has a cluster all to itself. High concurrency means that you can have a cluster spun up and you can connect multiple notebooks to that cluster at the same time. Very useful if you're editing and managing multiple notebooks at once. Just make sure you know that as far as Fabric goes, the high concurrency is unique to a user. At this moment, high concurrency sessions cannot be shared by multiple users in your Fabric environment. unless you want to share credentials with people, which is a great idea, right? What could possibly go wrong? Not the smartest thing to do. So even if you expect it to go with high concurrency, just know that is for a user on its own. Those high concurrency sessions cannot be shared. We'll go and click on this and start up a new standard session because, as I mentioned, we're going to be spinning up a whole lot of compute. So this is going to take clearly a lot of time to get this session up and running. Although let's take a look. What's going on with this notification here? Session started in 5 seconds. Databoard, you just told us that these compute sessions are like there's a lot of compute. There's a bunch of resources it has to spin up. That can't just magically happen in 5 seconds, can it? And you're right, it can't magically happen. That this is a whole magician's trick of Fabric doing magic things behind the scenes. Don't typically expect if you work in other types of non-Fabric environments that you'll get this type of experience. There's secrecy going on here, but let's expose the secret. What's happening here is tied to this environment being a workspace default. What this enables is a connection to what we call a live pool in Fabric. Essentially what that means is Microsoft has a bunch of Spark pools just sitting there in default configurations waiting for somebody to hit the connect button and to start up a default session. When you do that, instead of actively spinning up an actual Apache cluster, which could easily take minutes, if not longer, depending on your configuration, here you're actually connecting to a live pool, a pool that was already up and running by Microsoft behind the scenes. This is a kicker because especially for people looking to do things with things like environments, you need to then make sure if you want this and a custom environment, you need to look at what's called custom live pools. That's a little bit out of topic for today's presentation for sake of time, but more often than not, if you're going to go with custom configurations, expect it may take more than 5 seconds. But here, the magic of Fabric is we don't always have to wait that long. I know for a fact that I'm connected into a cluster because this has now changed to say it's a standard session. And I can go ahead and run my code here and confirm that it actively runs. And I'll know that it runs for sure because it has the display here, so we should see our data frame show up shortly. Spark jobs are running. It gives us some lovely in-progress information. And there we go. We did our successful E of our ETL. We extracted data out of a source. Any questions so far? At least been keeping an eye on it out of the corner of my eye, and no, nothing yet, which is fine. We can keep going. Now that's at least the E of ETL. What about the other two? T and L. Let's start with L because that's at least the easier one to explain. E is very easy to go for because more often than not, it's just a very simple call getting data from a source. This is at least what it looks like when you're accessing data from a Delta table sitting in a lakehouse. If you wanted to do the same thing, but you expect to interact with files instead, the call is fairly similar. We still define a variable because that's where data frame is going to live, but the notation is slightly different of Spark. Read indicates we're wanting to read or extract data from a source. And here, like other tools, we have to specify what is the structure of the file that we want to parse. In this case, we have to give it a couple properties. Format CSV, option of header indicates that the file is going to have a header, and load, which is where we give the path to get to that file. That is what would look like a simple read from a file. But an important thing to call out there is the notice that I just started with files over here. And there's files and tables and such over here. This is one of the unexpected benefits, but also things you need to keep an eye on when working with Fabric notebooks. The only reason that this here works is because I have this lakehouse attached to my notebook, and that it shows up here on the left. If I don't have anything connected, I have to go with a notation like this, which actually connects into the absolute path for the same file. But in this case, it is looking at it from the absolute path along the lines of connecting into blob storage, which is what lakehouses are behind the scenes. You'll also see too, this is where read up here, right down here is how we do the load portion. And for the most part, the syntax is actually fairly similar. Reference a data frame, say we're going to write, and then start putting in information. We're going to overwrite our destination if it exists, the format of it, and things like destination. It's that simple. And it's even simpler because Fabric allows us to use relative paths when we have a lakehouse connected. So let's at least take a look at a file here, and let's see an example here. This is at least a demo file share that or a file that I've created. I use this a lot for demonstrations, and ooh, whoa, what happened here? So this is information about performers, but clearly there's some issues here. One, Weird Al shows up a lot. Secondly, it says he only does reggae music, which clearly does not represent Weird Al's dynamic capabilities as a performer goes. Um, hmm. Well, let's see how serious this is. One of the nice things about doing this display function, which is unique to Fabric, is that we can see more of this table version of our data. We also get some quick charting options. And yeah, clearly here there's a problem. Weird Al has taken over my data set. Well, that's no good. Okay, so we've got some data quality issues. And of course, I didn't check my demo beforehand. And what's the syntax for dropping duplicates? We get into the transform aspect of things here. Um, but sometimes, at least when you're working with custom code, remembering all the syntax of doing things upfront can be a little complicated. That's where at least Fabric gives us an additional benefit. And no, I'm not talking about the Copilot button here, although you could use that to solve this problem of how do I clean up this data set, but that consumes a fair amount of capacity. I'm instead going to use something that is unique to notebooks in Fabric called Data Wrangler. I'm going to go ahead and kick this off because it takes a couple minutes. And while it's running, let me explain what's going on here. Right now, Data Wrangler is processing the data frame that I loaded into my notebook, and it's going to give me information about it. Now, what can I do with this in terms of transformations? Think of it this way. If you work with Power BI, you know that to do things in Power Query, you've got a UI experience that gives you some very simple ways of doing certain types of transformations and organizing them in a series of steps, and then that ultimately gets converted into M language, which is then used by the Power BI environment to actually ingest data. Data Wrangler is essentially the Power Query for PySpark. What this gives us is it gives us the capability of working with data the same way that we do with Power Query, but our end result is PySpark code. Let me show you how it works. First of all, it requires you to have a data frame loaded in an active Spark session. From there, you get a UI similar to what Power Query has. Operations, this will give us the options of things that we can do. Cleaning steps, this will define the individual steps. This bottom section, which is about previewing the code itself. And then the main section up here at the top, which will actually give us a profile of our data itself. So here we can clearly see, and I'll drag this for sake of size, that yes, we've got some problems. Weird Al has taken over our data set. So if I don't want to figure out the syntax up front and I'm just learning the language, one way to solve this is to use Data Wrangler to clean up our data. So here I've got a duplication issue, so I'll go under Find and Replace, and there's this handy dandy Drop Duplicates rows, and it innately knows what are the fields I expect to be unique, which in this case is pretty much everything other than the main identifier. I hit Apply, and my preview updates, and it also I can go back and take a look at the code that it generated. The other thing I noticed in here that we really need to fix is there's 4,000 unique ages in this data set. I don't think we have any 4,000-year-olds on the planet, which means this needs to be fixed. Obviously, it's coming from the fact that things are decimals, and I don't think anybody's keeping track of how many days old you are beyond a year. It's just not worth the time. So let's clean this one up. We'll go into schema, and there's a change column type. That seems fine. We can just convert it into an integer. Problem solved. So we'll take object as the type that it detected it as. We'll turn it into integer. And the nice thing about Data Wrangler, similar to Power Query, it gives you previews of the changes, but then it will also throw errors at you if the action you are trying to take at this step is going to cause an issue. So you get immediate feedback as you're designing things. So we can't convert straight to integer, but I can convert to a float and apply that. Well, that at least gets us down to 2 decimal points. I believe here above schema, there's a numeric. I can do a round operation to round the results to 0 decimals. That at least gets it to the right number. And now if I try again, go to change column type, convert this into an integer, this works for us. So here, Data Wrangler is a great tool that I encourage people to use when getting started with the language, because it'll help you identify what are some of the pitfalls you might run into rather than having to debug some random errors of running cells over and over again. Once I'm done with my Data Wrangler operations, I can hit this Add Code to Notebook, and I get this checkbox that says Include Pandas code, and it gives us a preview of the PySpark code. It's interesting. Let's hit the checkbox. See what happens. By doing that, we now have 2 cells added into our notebook. One is written in PySpark and performs all the operations necessary as we defined it in Data Wrangler to clean up the data on this data frame. But it also gave us a second cell, which looks very similar, but it keeps having these references to pandas. What is this all about? Well, when I said earlier, praise be the data frames, the workhorse of data professionals working with structured data. Technically, I should have said it, praise be the data frames, because in Spark, there's actually 2 that you have access to. One is what comes from the Python world, which Pandas is a library that's very popular in the Python world to define data frames and interact with data. The second comes from the Spark side of the equation and is a Spark data frame. Generally, I'll spare you the details, but the long and the short of it is make sure you pick the appropriate data frame carefully, because Pandas data frames, even in a Spark environment, cannot be distributed. It can only run on one node. Spark data frames, though, are where we get the resilient distributed data sets. It's the Spark data frames that are able to spread across the cluster. So generally speaking, large data sets use the Spark data frame, small data sets use the Pandas data frame. We can let this run for a little bit. But eventually, if this completes, it should give us the cleaned up data similar to what we saw in the last preview. Couple minutes left, so let's at least cover some last couple of things here. And this is what the data looks like in a clean state, which I prepared earlier. Let's see. The last thing I want to make sure that I cover here is what are some additional things that Fabric provides to make things easier. A lot of what I showed is about writing basic code to do extract, transform data, load data into storage. Well, let's maybe talk about things related to orchestration, such as parameters. We like having parameters. It makes it easy to say, if I can template a notebook and just pass in a given value, the notebook can dynamically adjust depending on the value that I pass in. Fabric Notebook supports this in a parameter cell, which gets this lovely indicator of parameters in the lower right corner of the cell. This is set by that ellipsis that I mentioned earlier, which gives us the option toggle parameter cells. I toggle it, it disappears. I toggle it back again, it reappears. What now happens is these two variables are now accessible by external calls, be it other Fabric notebooks that would call this notebook, or things like Fabric pipelines can also pass values into these parameters. The notebook looks at them as just variables, but the architecture Fabric allows you to look at them as parameters. Just be careful if you do use this. This is where, again, as you can see, no data types are defined. So make sure you know what values you need to pass into a parameter because the environment will not give you that information. Last thing I want to call out is two important libraries you should know about if you're going to work with notebooks in Fabric. As I mentioned earlier, libraries are about making your life earlier. And there's two cases where Fabric has libraries to simplify your work. The first one is SemPy, or if you hear anything about semantic link labs, very similar to this. SemPy is essentially a library in PySpark, in Fabric, that lets you do certain administrative functions and operations with semantic models. So if there are certain things you want to do with semantic models, and you want to do it in more of a coding approach with PySpark, SemPy enables you to do a lot of those capabilities. I don't do a whole lot with semantic models these days, but one thing I found that SemPy does, which is really useful, is if I'm wanting to write a process that can dynamically find a file across lakehouses and across workspaces. SemPy allows you to navigate across your entire Fabric workspace or your entire Fabric environment, provided you have the access to access those workspaces, and can let you identify, in this case, I'm looking for a lake house called DataBar Demo, and it found it in my workspace. Seems like a very simple thing, but this is something that gets really frustrating because in a lot of other ways, there's not a good way to do this. The second important uh, uh, library that you want to make sure you know is Notebook Utils, where SemPy is about semantic models, Notebook Utils is about lake houses, interacting with lakehouse storage, variable libraries, and things like that. So here, I write a pretty straightforward process that allows me to create functions that creates folder architectures within this lakehouse and is able to move files between them. For the most part, the code itself is pretty simple, uses a lot of the capabilities of languages thereof, but takes away the complication of having to know the full details of how storage works behind the scenes in Fabric. Fabric wants to make things easier for you. I suggest we're at the end of the demo. Mike asked a question, are there situations where we, for cost or other reasons, pick Python instead of PySpark sessions, or use Pandas data frame with a session over PySpark data frame? So the whole Pandas to the Pandas to Spark data frames, that really, it comes down to volume of data, because essentially what this changes is if you do Pandas or PySpark both in a Spark cluster, there your cost and your CPU consumption is about how long that Spark cluster is running. If Pandas is processing a large volume of data and takes longer than Spark would, you want to pick Spark because Spark will take less time, and because of that, you'll be able to shut off your Spark cluster faster. That's at least where you want to manage the cost on that front. Um, Python session instead of PySpark session or Python session versus PySpark session. Um, Python sessions take significantly less time to get started and have significantly reduced compute as a result. So Python sessions are the cheaper option, but that's because intentionally they do have less hardware they provision for you to run Python versus doing PySpark. So that's kind of your checks and balances on balancing cost versus performance. Python and native Python will be more cost effective provided that it doesn't take long to run your processes. But there are situations, and I've tested this previously, where at scale, Spark runs faster than Python, and because it runs faster, it's actually more cost effective at scale. So there, it's kind of a trade-off that you have to balance which one makes the most sense for you. All right, I know we're right here at 8 o'clock. I can keep going, and I only have about 5 minutes left of slides. So let's go ahead and wrap up here. I mentioned earlier, when you're working with Fabric, what does Fabric do to make your life easier? Hopefully today's demonstration showcases that aside from the capabilities of doing ETL operations with Spark and Python in the form of PySpark, you get a lot of extra bells and whistles besides. That UI features bar, which makes it really easy for end users to define the environment you need to work with, to connect into a session, and to get started connecting into your data really quickly. Markdown cells for documentation, that lakehouse warehouse connection, drag and drop to generate code. It's so much fun. Reading and writing is very simple calls. Data wrangler for transformations. Parameters if you're wanting to do with orchestration. Libraries, notebooks, utils, SemPy. What does Fabric do to make it easier to do PySpark? A lot. And this is stuff that has evolved significantly even within the about 3 years that Fabric has been generally available. If you ask me, this is going to keep evolving as time goes on. So where do you go from here? This is introductory, so of course you should expect to have to continue your journey, and data is always a journey. So where do we go next? Well, I suppose it really depends on what you feel are the next skills you need to learn to grow in this space. Couple of spaces, if it's more about some basic things to deal with within the context of Fabric specifically, use the built-in Data Wrangler in Copilot. Data Wrangler is really good for teaching what sorts of transformations you can do and in what order. Copilot can do the same thing, but again, using the built-in Copilot consumes capacity units, so use sparingly. If you're more of a visual learner and you're looking for some more guidance in there in a guided capacity, couple of things I strongly advocate for. Tales from the Field. If you're not subscribed to Tales from the Field right now and you work with Fabric, go to YouTube right now, find Tales from the Field, subscribe to their channel. It's a group of guys that work at Microsoft, um, either on the CAT teams for Fabric or on teams closely related to the CAT teams, and they create instructional videos like crazy on many capabilities, both notebooks and beyond. If Python's maybe where you need a little bit of strengthening, I highly encourage the Programming with Mosh YouTube channel. He has a really good video, Python for Beginners, Learn Python in 1 hour. He teaches you a lot of Python in an hour and does a really good job of documenting his content. I highly encourage it. Of course, the other one, a little bit of self-promotion, DataBard. I do a lot of content out there as well. But certainly, depending on where you want to go, Michael mentioned earlier, the communities are important out there. Part of the reason is getting connected with your fellow community members. The other part is there's a lot of communities out there that are consistently putting out educational content on topics like what I share with you today. You don't have to just rely on Microsoft Learn. You can rely on resources from other places. And with that, that brings us to the end of the story. So before I open up for any final questions, the data journey can be something that you do singularly. It can also be something that we go through together as a community. And I encourage you to band together. And if there's anything that I can do from here to help you take the next step on your data journey, here's a couple places to get a hold of me. Again, my YouTube channel, that QR goes to my YouTube channel, DataBard. I put out a lot of educational content on there. LinkedIn, I'd be happy to engage with you there. Most of the content that I build is driven by questions I get from people in the community. So if your question wasn't answered today and you have specific questions that you think I can answer, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to engage with you and answer questions as best as I can. Last part, and at least for sake of recording, because Michael mentioned it before we started the recording, if you're working with Fabric, I highly encourage you to join me on Friday mornings, 7:30 in the morning Central Time for Fabric Fridays. It's on the Kratos BI channel with a good buddy of mine. His name's Chris Wagner. We meet for an hour on Friday mornings, myself and 3 other Microsoft MVPs, to sit there and talk about current topics related to Fabric. Great free resource. There is no subscriptions or anything required. So I encourage you to come out there and engage with the community. We've got a lively community of people chatting there, asking questions, all because we want to help. But beyond that, that's at least all I have for questions or for content. So we'll jump into questions because I want to help you take the next step on your data journey. Let's see. Michael, you also asked, is there a rule of thumb for balancing the choice between pipeline, data flow, and notebook for tasks that the three can do? I'll say, at least for me, there's probably some nuance in there with they have different performance. But I would say, generally speaking, the pipeline data flow notebook discussion is about what is the skill set you want to use to implement your process. Do you like going code first? Notebooks is great for you. Do you like going low code, but you need like enterprise performance? Pipelines. And if you still want that low code experience, but this is more of a small data set, needs transformation, it's mostly for you individually as a user, I highly encourage the use of data flows in that case. But the biggest risk I see in cases like this is the data flows. Data flows can be very CU intensive compared to pipelines and notebooks performing similar functions. So if you have to choose between the three and you need to do enterprise functions, I would pick pipelines or notebooks over data flows. That's at least what I've seen so far in the community. Any other questions people have?
The other one in there is something that I can answer. The person was asking where would the recordings be, so I'll just quickly answer that.
At least at this point, we don't have any additional content. So, however, people want to ask questions in chat or Q&A or
It-
whatever your
So,
preference is.
so there are two. Do you have 5 minutes more? Because there are two
Mm-hmm.
house questions we ask every guest we get.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so great. I'll start with the house question one, which is tell us about your journey, how you ended up here. I know in your intro you kind of like but give some hints, but if you want to like go as far back as you can to tell us how you ended up in this space.
Well, I was born at a very young age of one day in Wisconsin. No, I won't go that far back. Um, Probably the most interesting part for my story is I kind of got into data by luck. My initial education is I'll spare you the details, but the long story short is I actually mostly have a theater degree that has a little bit of computer science baked into it. When I started working um, in the industry. I actually started working help desk work for just fundamental infrastructure for a nonprofit organization. And how I got into data was in working in that organization, they were working with a consultant to build out a business intelligence initiative. That was the popular term at the time. And the consultant left the practice, and somehow the consulting group managed to drop the contract along with it. Being a consultant now, I'm not quite sure how they pulled that off. But in any case, it left an incomplete warehouse in place. And I said, will you give me a shot at working with this because it's at least closer to computer science than the stuff that I'm doing right now at the help desk? And the company said yes. From there, I kid you not, I read in about 2009, there was a book published called the Microsoft Business Intelligence for Dummies book. If you're familiar with the For Dummies series, they actually published a book on Microsoft BI. I learned most of my foundational work on how to do things in the data industry from that book. And I built off of it now with a consulting career, which has led me in a whole lot of different paths and different functions, working in different industries. What I would at least encourage people on is I think the big lesson for me is uh, they always said in college, like, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. My career has pretty much proven that to be incredibly true. I would not be where I'm at right now. I'd also say, for the encouragement I've gotten from the community, I wouldn't be an MVP or presenting this kind of content without people that I know who knew the skill sets I had and encouraged me to get out here. I mentioned Tales from the Field initially, they're the ones who actually got me back out in the community and told me you need to get back out there and sharing knowledge. It's really why I'm here back at this point, and honestly, really enjoying it. I love doing this. This is some of the favorite parts of my day.
Yeah, maybe I can even sense it from the way you took the entire presentations, how you adapted to the answers from the audience when nobody raised their hand, how you sped through the Python intro, and then when you saw some hands raised. So it's like everything is fitting together, all of your different various experiences, you're able to make them merge, which like you shared. There's one more question, but if you allow me to just take a B out of the first question I asked, which is the big part of it will be how did you stay? It's easy for we all at one time do different things, give something different a try. But what made you stay so much that you left every other skills and whatever you could have done as a career? I know you would always have your theater skills and other things that it's genuine passion for you, which you still do. But in terms of career choice, you decided that you were going to make this the focus so much that you're now a consultant. That's how deep anyone can go. You've like said this is the peak of this is what you really want to do. How did you stay focused and not get distracted over the decade with new tools, with new uh stuffs coming up?
Um, I'll say there, honestly, like my focus is probably it looks more focused than I think it actually is. I get very scatterbrained when push really comes to shove. And I'll say at least that's where consulting kind of worked well for me because it gave visibility into what it seemed like the demand was out in the community, and then just learning to adapt. The biggest thing that I think I've carried with me, and it's the one thing that I do some mentoring for people on the community if they're looking for somebody to give advice on if they're early in their career and want at least an outside opinion on where they should go. I've helped people in those sorts of capacities. The one thing that I encourage them is at this point, if you haven't learned how you learn things, before you really do anything else right now, that's what you should spend your time on. Once you get past college, where you go with your career is up to you, but also to your point, in tech, we need to learn skills to remain relevant. And at that point, maybe some companies will encourage you to learn certain things, and that will determine what you focus on. But your career's your own. Where you take it is up to you. And the only way to get there, companies aren't going to necessarily push you where you want your career to go. The only way you can get there is to learn things on your own. And that brings you back to that question that I asked earlier. How do you learn things? If you don't know how to learn things, you're going to easily get stuck in your career. So for me, I learn things by getting very hands-on, getting very experimentary, and honestly, for me, um, it's kind of the running joke we have on Fabric Fridays. I'm the code breaker. I'm the guy who takes environments and intentionally does the things you shouldn't do with it to break it. Not just because I like breaking things, but because I learn a lot from breaking something, pushing it to its limits and seeing what happened. That has turned into a lot of foundational learnings for me. Um, Admittedly, sometimes very costly ones because that sometimes comes with it. Um, but yeah, I'd say at least that's what keeps me focused is like be flexible, be willing to deal with the trends, and honestly pick your direction of where you want to go, and then how you learn is going to get you the rest of the way.
Great, thanks. So the second question, it's a twist because you kind of answer what we ask most other people, which is your advice to the audience. So I'm going to give you a different second question, which will be something I'm interested in hearing your answer to. What's your approach with AI? What do you think it's, maybe I'll say it is, what do you think is the right approach? And if you want to use your own approach to answer it, also good.
Ooh, the AI question. Okay. So this is where it's very interesting. You look at my YouTube channel, I do a fair amount on SSMS, GitHub Copilot, so I'm at least advocating for it to a point. But here's kind of where I stand. Um, AI has benefits that are out there. There are, I think, some really good use cases for AI, but I'll say more often than not, uh, the directions companies are looking to implement AI aren't the ones that will actually provide them value. So here's at least a couple of the things that I would encourage. One is be very careful about using AI as a replacement for knowledge. This is where I kid you not, I have had conversations with people who are saying, I'm using AI in this particular use case, or I'm trying to do this with my organization because I don't trust my users to analyze data effectively. To be clear, there in a situation like that, that's not a like process problem. That's not really a tech problem. That's an education problem in your organization. If anything, we need to make sure that no matter what we do with AI, that we remain on our top game as far as being able to effectively criticize, critically think, and apply that to the work that we do day in and day out. Because without that, yeah, we'll get some innovations and such going on here, but at some point we'll hit a level where the level isn't about what AI can achieve, it becomes what humans can understand, and that's a problem for me. Um, the other thing at least I get into is if you're going to take time to use AI and be a strong proponent for it, make sure you're actually measuring what the benefit is that you want to get out of it and measure if you're actually getting it or not. Um, I've run at least a couple videos on my YouTube channel where the intentional reason I do it is they're longer videos, but it's with the intention of showing this is what it takes to do this with AI, and I can compare that to how long it takes me to do the same operations, which I know I've already done, and it takes longer, but then I can actually measure what are the time savings that I get from it. To have that measurement makes a whole big difference in advocating for AI versus what a lot of people do nowadays, which is just, I built things with AI and therefore I have value. Don't go there. We don't need to get a bunch of data centers just for people to generate an image of cats. Go take a picture of a cat. Like, by all means, go and do that. Um, so I'm of a like AI has value. Is AI around to stay? Yes. I'm a strong advocate for before you take time to use AI, really think, is this something where it's genuinely worthwhile to use AI for this case? And then measure whether you actually got the value out of it or not. Without that, we're going to get where a lot of us end up being, and we don't like it, is these really sprawled architectures for organizations that have way more tech in the equation than they should. And it's because they implemented tech for tech's sake. They didn't implement it because they actually had a problem to solve.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a very value-driven and practical way to uh, and I like that you answered it from the perspective of using AI within a work, within an organizational setting. So for me, I am happy that what you're saying kind of aligns with what I've been learning here and there and trying to also uh, do, though. Sometimes I just want to use it for using its sake so I can say, oh, yeah, I know how to use AI for this and that, and I don't check if there's a value. That's the one key thing that I'm going to try to adjust in my approach. Not just do it and believe that because I use AI is better than whatever other approach I could have taken, but I actually
Mhm.
do the other approach, and measure, and which is what as data professionals we are meant to do, like gather as many data points as possible and make an informed decision. But sometimes people like me and some of us that just want to use the tech for tech's sake, we
Mhm.
forget that. So thank you very much. I know the room has been more quiet than even what I told you in the intro call, that we usually get questions. But I'm not surprised because you have done the whole session in such a way that I probably would not be following for me not to understand something to now come back and ask a question. So if people are paying attention, I'm not surprised that they are not asking questions because you kind of have asked the question and then you've answered it as your way of explaining to us. And I know people ask for someone asks for the recording. So that's sometimes the signal that, they want to keep watching and going back to it. So thank you very much. We've taken 20 more minutes than the original time slot. But thanks for being generous with your time and sharing your knowledge. And your approach of sharing knowledge and teaching things is unique. It's not very common that we have someone who makes sure that whether you're a beginner or you're an intermediate or you're an expert, you get to learn something. If an expert is going to learn from this session, and a beginner for sure was carried along. So thank you very, very much. And we have come to the end of today's session, and I've shared the QR, this screen, I screenshot it, I put it in the chat. So usually, well, this is my understanding that the chat stays even for people who are in attendee mode. So if you want to still access the links to follow DataBad, it's also there in the chat. I placed the link. Alex also placed. I tried to look for the session you talked about on Friday, but I could only get Chris's YouTube, so I wasn't so sure if that's the one to share. But I know if they follow you, they will eventually land there too. So thank you very, very. Oh, there's the Fabric Fridays QR code. So yes, you can use the QR code to also uh, become part of the audience for this week's and subsequent Fabric Friday session. So thank you very much, Jared, and I will let you go have a good night rest. And to everybody who has stayed with us till this time, thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day, and the recording will be on YouTube sometime this week. So thank you very, very much. Bye to everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for sticking around. Great to see everybody. You all take care.
Thank you. Bye.